Now, I can't remember exactly when, but I have been in this room before, John, with you, in front of this cabinet, which has got a number of different fascinating examples of computing through the ages, which is probably stretching it a bit, because the computing age isn't quite as long as that sounds, is it? Is this we stood in front of an IBM 1620 data processing system with some interesting switching gear on the front that I haven't really seen the like of before. What is this, and why is this in this particular case?
Well, what you're looking at is all that's left of the first electronic computer Swansea University bought. And it was in 1961 that the then principal, a historian, Professor Parry, made the decision to purchase a machine. And I've got the figures here, and indeed the paperwork. It cost us £22,336. And of that money, we had 12,500 from something called the University Grants Committee, which was the organisation that's been funding universities for many years. But it did mean that we had to put in over £9,000 of our own money.
Right, and we're talking significant amounts of money.
1961.
In 1961. Do you know what the equivalent would be now? I don't, by the way.
No.
You're not an economist, are you? So
no.
But it's a significant amount of money.
It's a very significant amount of money. And it is an interesting machine, the IBM 1620. It attracted a lot of criticism, and it wasn't very long before the university was contemplating buying a much bigger, more powerful machine, which it did with the help of a major national initiative organised by a Swansea man called Lord Flowers. But this particular machine served for many years. Gradually, as the years went by, it became more and more something of a plaything.
Right.
But if you read this wonderful sign on the front of it, or shall I read it for you?
Well, I can read it.
Yes, for your listeners, I think it might be interesting.
Well, okay. Well, you read it, because you have a more sonorous voice than I do.
Oh, good heavens!
Well, I think that's a major compliment,
right,
given how sonorous my voice is.
Right. So on the front of this panel of the IBM 1620, put on much later than the time it was purchased, is the following notice in red: students are advised not to adjust this equipment in any way. Anyone found doing so will be held responsible. This could prove expensive. And then it says, in case of fault, telephone 363.
363, not even an extension code or anything like that.
No.
So what was this computer being used for?
Oh, scientific calculations of a very simple kind. It's an interesting machine because it is something that sort of was born in the late 50s and had the property that you could interact with the program while the program was running. It had tape and all sorts of other peripherals, and it was used for all sorts of things. In fact, in the cabinet, as you see, you'll notice that there is a photograph of some people cuddling one of these IBM 1620s. And in fact, that is a newspaper photograph of people using that particular machine for typesetting newspapers in about the same year. So it had a very versatile behavior because it was a relatively cheap machine. In fact, it was so cheap that they really economized on the hardware and cut out all sorts of things that we would take for granted. In fact, they even cut out the ability of the hardware to do additions.
Oh, really?
So everything was software-based.
Yeah.
And it had various nicknames, some of which weren't very complimentary.
Okay. So
I think it's a lovely machine, and it's very 60s in design.
Yeah, indeed. And this is just the interface.
Well, the front panel.
Yeah. So how much bigger would the entire thing have been?
As you can see in the photograph, it's probably the size of a small piano.
Yeah, and that's it. That's the entire computer.
That was it, yeah.
Because frequently when people talk about computers from that era, they'll say it filled a room or filled an entire floor. But this was designed to be a business machine, not necessarily a research system. No, this wouldn't have been at the vanguard of computing necessarily at the time.
There's probably about 20 properties of a computer, which at any one time you can look at and say, but wait a minute, we saw that feature early on. So if I was saying to you now, you need machines, right, that don't use much energy. Therefore, the hardware must be simple. And therefore, a lot of things got to be done with instructions rather than hardware.
Yeah.
then suddenly you're throwing away lots of special features. And if you play that game, you could involve the old 1620, which economized on hardware,
Yeah.
and say, well, the ARM processors that are famous in mobile phones, and famous because they deliberately reduced power simply by reducing the facilities of the hardware, you could see that trend in design already here.
Even back in 1961,
Yes,
which
yes.
is remarkable. So this was the first computer at Swansea University.
Yes. I mean, yes.
What were the first computers that came to Wales, John?
No, this is a very interesting question, and in fact, I really hope that one effect of your program is for all sorts of individuals to ask questions of their friends and family about what they know about how computers came into their lives. But I believe the first computer to come to Wales was a machine bought by the Steel Company of Wales in Port Talbot, and it was a Ferranti Pegasus.
A Ferranti Pegasus.
A Ferranti Pegasus.
Wonderfully evocative name.
Yes, indeed. And it's a marvelous machine. There are several still in existence, and indeed there's a wonderful copy of this machine in the Science Museum in London that has been restored. And it was restored by a man called Tony Sale, who later became very well known because he also then later on restored the great Colossus machine in Bletchley Park, which is now much celebrated.
Yeah, yeah.
But if I can talk about the Pegasus for a moment, I'd be happy to if you're interested.
Yeah, well, that's why I asked you about the Pegasus.
Right, okay.
So, tell us about it, because you mentioned the code-breaking machines that they had at Bletchley.
Yes.
Were they the first computers that we had? Some of the first,
Amongst
born
the
out
earliest,
of necessity, and a lot of technical advancement made over a relatively short amount of time because we needed to break these codes.
Absolutely.
And Turing's genius obviously firing that.
Oh, well, now you're getting into a whole special area which will take us away from the theme of your program.
Okay, but it's important to mention those names.
Oh, yes, they're all connected.
Yeah.
They're all connected. And in fact, it depends. Remember I said a moment ago that you can pick 20 features of a computer and you can see the ebb and flow of these ideas. Nothing is thrown away because ultimately it's very abstract. But you could ask the question, who amongst the most early pioneers of using electronics to count anything?
Yeah.
And if you did ask me that question, I would say a man from Cocket in Swansea.
Right, really?
Yes, Charles Wynne Williams.
Right.
He was born here, was educated in Bangor in the Department of Applied Electricity.
Okay.
Yes. And he got a job with Rutherford, the great physicist, who had a problem. His problem was that he was making very important experiments about the structure of the atom using photographic plates. And these experiments were very subtle, and there were tricky problems about getting them reproduced in other labs. And Charles Wynne Williams, who was an extremely able electrical engineer and working in this physics laboratory, devised counters in order to do certain kinds of physical counting. And many people would cite Wynne Williams as one of the earliest people to apply electronics to counting devices in the service of atomic physics.
And would he have used a principle or adopted any kind of principles that we recognise now within the computers? So, a binary or on-off signal?
Well, that's an interesting question, which I think the answer to that is probably later on in life. But at the early stages, he had a very practical problem. And it wasn't counting in the sense that we would do arithmetic. It was literally trying to accumulate information about charged particles. But back to the Pegasus.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now I have a box here. This is a lovely box. And in here I have all sorts of documents from the Pegasus in Port Talbot.
And these are the original documents that came...
Can I dig them out?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Yes. And here we are. This is the programming manual, as used by programmers at the time. And as you can see, they're beautiful documents.
Well, you've got an A4 sized typed...
They're not A4, they are foolscap.
Yeah.
Slightly larger.
Slightly larger
that
size,
dates me, I think.
Yeah.
You're excused from that. But the Pegasus is a very famous British computer. They made about 40. And the one that Port Talbot bought was number 24, I believe. Number 24. And it was a jolly interesting story behind it, because some years ago I was speaking to some pioneers of programming in Port Talbot. It was bought in order to design the new steelworks, the Abbey Works.
To design
it.
Okay.
Right. And they started to have a complete new idea, a new conception of an important new steelworks that was going to be one of the top steelworks in the world. And they built up a whole big office of more than 30 people who did operations research, the sort of process planning that was very commonly done in the war. You know, because the war was very mathematical in terms of planning, the logistics, and so on. And
when you say the process, the steel making process in this,
yes, they had to. They were going to build one of the great steelworks, which, by the way, they achieved. So they had about 30 people doing complex calculations about how to make a steelworks. For example, scheduling the melting shop where the ore is melted down and so on.
And making it efficient. And because it's such a massive operation, making sure that things come in one end and then can flow and actually reach the other end, and you've got the finished product.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the steel making process changes in detail, but in overall structure, it's pretty similar to steel making for the last 200 years. So anyway, so they had this 30-odd people, and I was having a lovely conversation with a man called John Dacey from Port Talbot, who I believe could easily be Wales's first computer programmer.
Right.
I don't know, but I believe he is. Now, John used to write complicated programs to do simulations of things going on in this, understanding the melting shop. Later on, they worked on the design of the harbour and various other things they needed. And he would do this work in Port Talbot on paper. He would get on a train and go up to London for a week and run the programs at the British Steel Central Computers in Park Lane. Later it moved to Battersea, but this is in the 50s now, 1957 onwards. And after a certain amount of time, this became so important that the steelworks thought, well, we'll buy one of these Pegasuses that John is using, and we'll build a building and we'll put it in. So that's how Wales got Pegasus number 24.
But what kind of calculations specifically was Pegasus doing? You said it designed or helped design the steelworks.
Scientific simulations of various aspects of their work, and in fact,
what simulations of the temperature or the flow, or
I'd have to actually get down John Dacey's paper with neat,
right,
and actually read very carefully precisely what they were calculating.
But interestingly,
it was a very interesting thing, and in fact, if I remember correctly, the British Computer Society, which is the society in Britain, one of the earliest national learned societies for computing. I think volume 2 of their journal, which continues today, carries a paper by Neat and Dacey on this subject.
Okay.
So it's all beautifully documented, but I'm afraid you've caught me on the hop.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting that they were that he was simulating an environment.
Oh yes,
it's the kind of thing that we
and
do
an industrial
now.
problem.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that 57 and through to 60, they actually got their own Pegasus, I think, delivered in February 61. I believe so.
And to you now, looking at it, from our point of view, 60 years later, how powerful a machine was it? Is it something that you have a respect for from its potential, its power point of view? Or is it something that you have a respect for because it's a historical artifact? It's some of the first steps taken in this particular science.
This is a very interesting question. I think about this from time to time, because when one looks at old computers, particularly something like this, you really are looking at a historical artifact. And in order to enter into the spirit of it, you have to try to learn up what for me would be a lost technology. Not for everyone, not for an electrical engineer. So if you knew a lot about electrical engineering and the complexities and the competences of people designing, essentially thinking in terms of electronics at that time, then they are very, very good machines, very competitive machines. And their fame is always one for technical people rather than commercial people, because the great shadow of American technology and business know-how was so far superior than we ever managed to sort out ourselves in the UK. The story of British computing industry from a commercial point of view is another type of story. But so it doesn't, for me, they don't have the same excitement that if you went to, let us say, a tank museum, or or even better, an aircraft museum, where you're looking at figures that even to an ordinary individual now are totally astonishing. You know, the speed of fire of a Spitfire. You don't have to. You're impressed by virtue of the actual achievement of the artifact. You don't really have to know much about the state of engines at that time to say, well, didn't they do well? Do you see what I mean? But in computing, it's very difficult because the progress is so astronomical, and because we have become familiar with it in every day. I mean, I'm not familiar with running around at 400 or 500 miles an hour.
No.
Still a bit of an achievement in an EasyJet.
Most definitely.
But one wouldn't buy a computer that didn't have so many, the iPhone, what is it, 1.3 gigahertz? That's the sort of speeds you buy in the store. You can go to the store at any time in the last 10 years and buy enough memory to photograph yourself every 5 minutes from the time you're born to the time you die. I mean,
easily.
So now compare that with the memory structures of the day.
What a horrific image. Not a view, I'm glad that hasn't happened to me yet. I know people who seem to do it on Facebook, though. Now, with regards to the programming manual for the Ferranti Pegasus computer, if you open that up, will we see any processes detailed that would be familiar to computer scientists now?
Well, I think the answer to that would be more or less yes, because many of these machines do have a common base. And you have to spot that when you look at these kind of documents, which are designed for really hands-on practitioners, you're looking at people that need to know detailed numerical information. And what happens in modern times is when we talk about the structure of computers, particularly in a university where we're supposed to be educating for the future, we tend to talk in generalities that have the property that they're a bit portable, that they can be applied to all sorts of gadgets and machines. So apart from the fact that the detail is far more overwhelming, yes, the basic machine codes are not very far removed, except that possibly we have so many new software tools that the need to write very careful coded instructions and be fully aware of how memory is allocated, of course, is something that is now highly specialized in computing and electronics.
But in essence, the Ferranti Pegasus computer, the first computer in Wales, was performing mathematical operations. And even though it was performing them exponentially slower than my iPhone or Nexus or whatever, performs now, it still had an economic, it still had a value to engineers at the time. It was still doing it quicker than they could do it.
Well, I think John told me when that some of the simulations and calculations that they were using before they got into digital computing with the Pegasus, which for a long time they were doing by going to London on the train. If you wanted to schedule an 8-hour job, it would take 8 hours. And this is a phenomenon that you do see in engineering. I'm not quite sure it's a good analogy, but we've seen over the last 20 years high-powered computer modeling helping to cut the amount of wind tunnel work that an aerofoil has to have as part of that design, because wind tunnels are fantastically expensive, and the laboratory work with them is expensive too and time-consuming. So you do see, even in our times, areas of life that are falling within the tools that digital computers can provide. But at the time of that steelworks, this enormously helped them get the job done and build a terrific steelworks that was the envy of Europe for many years.
So, John, let's talk now about the Stantec Zebra, which was that the first computer made in Wales? Is that why it's got a a particular part of the Welsh computing history.
I think that's right. But so the Stantec Zebra was made in Newport, Corporation Road. And it was a machine based on designs by a Dutch computer scientist called Van der Poel. And he had got hold of documents that were circulating at the time.
What time are we talking about now? What year would
His
that
thesis
be?
was 1956.
Right.
And that was the output. The output of his PhD thesis was a design for a computer. He was working for a very famous Dutch computer scientist called Ad van Wijngaarden, who was a major figure in the development of machines in Europe. And in fact, gave me a job for a few years. I knew him at the Mathematical Centre in Amsterdam. Anyway, Van der Poel was there, and he wrote this thesis, and it was picked up. And they built, I'm not sure how many, you'd have to check, but possibly as many as 40 of these Stantec Zebras. And they did all sorts of things. Cardiff University had one. In particular, Glamorgan University, well, University of South Wales today, at that time had a very pioneering course on numerical and computational methods. And the students in Pontypridd would be taught all kinds of techniques, and then they'd get on a little minibus and drive to Newport to run their programs.
All of the machines that we've talked about so far compressed into a very short amount of time, actually. We're talking 5761 up, up to the IBM 1620.
But I think a lot of manufacturers thought we'll have a go at making machines. I even suspect, although I've not seen one, that the Singer Sewing Machine Company actually had plans to go into making computers. So it was an exciting time. Huge advances in electronics, completely rebuilding the manufacturing infrastructure after the war, and of course people could see dramatic improvements in every field that was technical through the use of these computers.
And was one of the reasons for that because they were reliable? I mean, what was it that gave them a power and a necessity almost, even back then?
Well, of course, their ability to do very large calculations very quickly was extraordinary even then. It's very easy to forget the speeds with which these calculations take place in those times. I mean, that's the main reason. And people were calculating like that. If you imagine Britain in the course of the war, it was fundamentally given over to manufacturing. The Bridgend Arsenal had 30 to 40,000 people working it there over the period of the war. Bletchley Park peaked at 40,000 people doing code breaking. The scale of mobilizing a nation, and in particular a lot of it to do with manufacturing and infrastructure. Plane production was on a grand scale. So we had a big legacy of technical achievement, which was now finding civil applications. Not unlike many things. They start off with the great patronage of military.
Well, yeah, indeed, military and then industrial, needs driving computer development and evolution.
That's right.
Perhaps the next obvious step on this timeline that I'm imagining would be the Dragon 32 or the Dragon computers.
Yes.
In Wales.
And the 32 and the 64.
Yeah, because I remember, I remember when the first computer that I would have got would have been 83 or 84, BBC. Fortunately, otherwise this could have been an awkward link. But I remember the Dragon being around at the same time, and obviously the British 8-bit computer boom of the period. How important a part did Dragon play in that?
Well, there were lots of machines around at that time by many manufacturers, and it's very difficult to identify objectively the way in which all of these things, if you like, competed. But there was a great market. It was sold in the United States. It was remanufactured in Spain later on, and it survived several years. And in Port Talbot, of course, it really did have an interesting factory, and I think Tony Clark was involved in that and was quite well known in the industry. But I'd be very loath to judge, because the literature on it, and I wasn't involved with Dragon in any way, is very much done by enthusiasts for whom this machine had a special role,
Yes.
especially for manufacturing of games and things of this
Yeah.
kind. But it was certainly a completely successful and sensible machine.
And both Sinclair and Acorn, which were the major
Yes.
British players at the time, were
British,
based
exactly.
in Cambridge and
Yes.
and had the advantage of the Cambridge mathematics department as almost kind of the intellectual engine behind it. And I would imagine it was important, or quite an achievement for Dragon to be based in Newport, to be competing.
Oh, it's Port Talbot.
Port Talbot,
Port
sorry.
Talbot, yeah.
But to be competing on almost a level playing field as
Oh, yes.
Acorn.
No question.
And of course, there's still a legacy with Acorn because they design, in essence, the ARM chips that we mentioned earlier, don't they?
Absolutely, and lots of interesting connections all over the place.
But it's a shame that there isn't that legacy from Dragon Computing. And is that literally perhaps a problem with the location and them not being? Was there too much against them, in other words?
I couldn't judge because I think a lot of these questions are partly technical and partly commercial.
Yeah.
But the move to 64-bit that Dragon did was in response to other companies, their big international competitors already going there first. So it was a reaction. So there is a sense in which they had an edge for a while, and then in catching up, so to say, that is a little clue, if you like, to the struggle for a small company.
Yeah, indeed.
And so on.
Especially at the time, because I think that the reason, I think we must have considered a Dragon computer at the time, but then just thought there wasn't enough software for it.
Well,
and that's the thing.
That is another one. I mean, for many, many years, Apple products in the UK were shunned, if you like, by the general commercial retailers. And I've often, in the past, gone into stores and asked about various Apple products, for an idle moment, and been completely shocked at the ignorance of the staff.
Yeah.
But of course that's changed now. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But and then you have the problem of the software base, of course, which is always a big problem and is a real issue today because if you're a PS3 player, where is Halo?
Okay. Now, just finally, you've lived, worked, educated through this fascinating period. Not all of it, but a lot of it. No. Is there any equivalent in science or research that mirrors this explosion of computing power that we've had over the last 50, 60 years and quite how ubiquitous these devices have become in our lives now? Is there an equivalent?
No, I don't think there is. My immediate reaction to that would be to try to point out the enormous progress of materials science. The kind of materials that were around when I was young was a very, very small set of materials that you came across. And in fact, in the collection, not displayed in the cabinets yet, is a keyboard with wood and leatherette as part of its manufacture, which reminds one again of the materials available. And now, of course, one designs materials to order at the level of commercial products.
But it's difficult.
So that would be one.
But obviously computers have enabled an awful lot of that.
Absolutely.
Material science and research into material science.
Let me offer you another one. And the purpose of offering these is really to give some evidence that in fact computers are special and that you're right, that they're extraordinary. The other thing you might say is, well, let's look at our understanding, a careful understanding of genetics. Now, people were doing X-ray crystallography and doing very complex calculations on the structure of certain biological molecules, as is well known from the story of the double helix. A Stantec Zebra, by the way, was being used in Cardiff to do X-ray crystallography in the 50s.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. The biologists and the biosciences were using computing fairly early on. It's quite an interesting thing that we tend to neglect.
Yeah, well, how? Because we've talked about the history of the devices, we've talked about industrial applications, but not necessarily research applications as well.
Dozens of those, both in industry and also in pure science. But I would say that even in genetics, the timescales, the complexity, and so on, of the harvesting, if you like, the products of understanding genetics and the DNA revolution. will take a lot longer to show the same kind of totally dramatic changes that we take for granted, because the penetration of computing now is quite extraordinary. If you think, well, here's an example about penetration. It's not about you and your iPhone, and it's not about the fact that you're on Facebook. It's not about even the ability that we now like to put chips in things, which we do. So putting a chip and software into a product is now quite commonplace. How many chips are in your motor car?
Oh, well, fridge. It's always the one that shocks me.
Now, there's 2 points to be made about that. First, every computing device keeps a log of what's going on. So all of these chips, which are now everywhere, are self-logging. So that we talk about the Internet of Things because you could also network them. So if you really stand back and ask the question, what is the nature of your digital self? In theory, you will see that there are dramatic numbers of what you might call databases, real and imagined, that would provide the most unbelievable comprehensive picture of your life. So we have the technology to produce very, very thorough images of a person's life because so much is registered digitally.
But we're producing so much data,
And we're producing
each
so
and
much
every one
data.
of us, that it's...
But in order for this thing of surveillance and privacy to be a big issue, which it is, though very ham-fistedly discussed normally, a rather arcane discussion.
It's a whole of the programme, I suspect, but it is an
it's
importance of the programme.
But what's underlying it is the deep ubiquity of software everywhere.
Yeah.
That's what enables this surveillance to start being a big issue.
What kind of computer science innovation is going on in Wales at the moment? I mean, we've made a programme at the Raspberry Pi factory. So
wonderful.
From a hardware point of view,
right.
that was incredibly inspiring. Is there still computer science innovation going on in Wales that is recognised outside the country?
I think so, but that would be, again, another big topic. And
well, what kind of fields within computer science, because it's a broad field, are being researched within Wales?
Well,
perhaps the other landmarks that might be on that imaginary timeline that I've got.
Well, I would say, putting aside applications where very expensive high-performance machines are being applied to all sorts of interesting problems, putting those aside, but looking at computer science development itself, the emphasis is very much on software. But to take a very simple example, and to take one from Swansea, I would cite a colleague of mine, Harold Thimbleby, who has, some years ago, observed that in any medical situation, you are surrounded by a large number of gadgets and devices, all of which are software-based. And he got very interested in the way in which engineers in medical instrumentation cooked these things up. And if I can say that if you've ever set up a complex TV with a video recorder or DVD recorder, plus try to get the internet working, plus this, plus that, plus the other, you realize that the interfaces to these things are diabolically awful.
Indeed, yeah.
Now, the frustrations that might take place in your home is one thing, but hard-pressed medical professionals, particularly nurses, for example, reading from scribbles, complex numerical information about, let us say, a fusion pump, it's positively dangerous.
Yeah, well, calibrating things so that they're accurate.
Exactly. And there are all kinds of errors that can be arise simply from the design of the software, which is uniformly grim.
And
so he's been working on that very heavily. And that side of his work, I would say, is an example of curiosity-driven work, because out of his curiosity, he got interested in how awful pocket calculators were. all the errors that you can make if you look for them in a pocket calculator. And therefore, he was familiar with this very simple problem as a fun problem. And then one day there was that moment in a hospital looking at all this equipment, and there were signs on some of this equipment written by a nurse well, not dissimilar from our student sign, don't touch this. There could be problems. And being interested in the user experience and user interfaces and being very, very technical so that you can combine what goes on inside the machine with the understanding of how people interact with machines. He's set on a path that's now 7 years old to really look at what you might call safety critical medical design.
Well, sort of from curiosity, but to solving something that's mission critical. Life critical.
Yes, indeed.
Now, finally, you've gone to the trouble of bringing
a few items.
This large sheet of paper. Now, you're clearly an expert on paper sizes, as I found out earlier when I said
I don't know
A4, and that was full scale. Well, this is A2, say, an A2 piece of paper that dates from, what did you say, 1993, 1994?
Yes, that's right.
Kind of time.
Yes, and it was made in America.
Yeah.
For a popular computer magazine, and then republished here in Britain by a magazine called PC Direct.
And it looks like a little bit like a tube map, but obviously, not quite as condensed or beautiful. But it has, it's a map clearly. But what's it a map of, John?
It is a map of the internet.
Right. It's a map of the entire internet
as
it stood.
Well, a map of the World Wide Web part of the internet around 94.
Okay, there was a much more important distinction to be made between the internet and the World Wide Web at the time, wasn't there?
Yes.
So this is the World Wide Web as it stood. Now,
and so
I'm going to roughly estimate.
The idea is that you're a reader of this magazine and you pull out this map and it's giving you tons of suggestions to go and explore this brand new thing called the World Wide Web. And since you have no clue where to go or what to see, why don't you use this map?
And it seems to have about, this is a very rough estimate, 30 to 40 nodes, and with sites coming off it, they're big red dots.
That's right.
And the reason that we have it out here, bearing in mind that this is a worldwide, a map of the World Wide Web, is that there are some sites, important sites, of particular Welsh interest.
Yes. In this little corner down here, there's a big node which says United Kingdom-based World Wide Web service. And off this node are exactly 6 sites.
Yeah.
One of them is Her Majesty's Treasury. They had a page. But 2 are of great interest to us. First, the Swansea University had a page. And in that times, the one page that we had was all about surfing. And the reason is that we got into the World Wide Web through the physics department.
Right.
And a colleague was in UCLA, it's the University of California, Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And he'd seen this new software that had come out of CERN being used by the experimental physicists. And he thought, this is interesting. So he installed it on the theoretical physics machines at UCLA, got more interested, sent it back to his students, and said, play with this, get it up. So they did.
Because this is where the HTTP protocol was designed by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that despite this marvelous thing coming out of CERN and passing through UCLA physics, when it got to Swansea, the postgrads, who had obviously an interest in it, decided, well, we'll build a website about surfing in Gower, which is what they did, and it registers on this big American map. But there's an even more intriguing Welsh connection in Cardiff, because Rob Hartrill, who was another PhD student in Cardiff in the computer science department there, he got terribly interested in this, and because he was interested in films, he collected all kinds of information about films that was on the internet but not on the World Wide Web. In other words, they were in files that weren't rendered and displayed in a nice way. And he built a web interface. And so he had something called, I think, the Cardiff Movie Database.
Right, yeah.
And this lived for some years, and then it grew, and then it was commercialized by him. Then it was bought by Amazon, and it became the Internet Movie Database that virtually all of us use whenever we want to know about a film. And the origins of that
are in Cardiff University.
In Cardiff University.
This
and
fascinating.
Rob Hartrill. And may I say that at the first big World Wide Web conference in Switzerland in 1994, they had 6 heroes of the internet. One was Tim Berners-Lee. I won't mention the others, but one was Rob Hartrill.
Isn't that well? Is he still around?
After that, he went to work on an amazing project at Los Alamos to do archiving of scientific papers, which every physicist uses all the time. Then he worked for a software organization called Apache, which is an open source thing, and was famous for its web facilities. And then he gave it up, and I think via a spell in Ogmore by Sea, he moved to South Australia, and I'm afraid I've lost touch with his story. But you guys,
we should track him down for the 20th anniversary of that particular conference that he was a key speaker at. Yeah. Well, Radio Wales, we might have to go to South Australia.
I think that's a good idea.
What a bummer.
The weather might be a bit less rainy.
I might try some surfing. John, thank you very much indeed. That was excellent. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you for your interest.